welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jen, and I'm joined by the author of a gorgeous novella that is a beautiful piece of dark fantasy with really, really wonderful characters and beautiful world building. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, my name is Jelena Dunato. I'm an author from Croatia, and my novella, Ghost of Parents, is coming out on September 24th.
It is so beautiful. And before we get into the book specifically, I'd love if we could talk a little bit about your career and your journey to this book. I understand that you are an art historian and a curator as well as a writer, and I'm really curious about how you think that sort of affected your approach to writing or your perspective.
Well, I think that my art history and my museum career affects everything that I write, because I've always been interested in art, and I think that art is a very important part of my books, because when I describe the settings, when I describe when I build the worlds, I always ask myself what they actually look like, what does their art look like, what they enjoy, and I think that I've managed to put a lot of art in this novella, and I don't mean just visual arts. I think this is also a story about stories, a story about poems, a story about, because obviously books are very important both for Orsiana and for her father. And so I try to include as much art as I could. But also, I think that one of the reasons I chose to study art history is because I always wondered, like, who are these people in these pictures? What were their lives like? So I'm always putting art in my stories, but I'm always looking for stories in the art I think about. So I think it's connected, and I couldn't do one without the other.
That is really cool too, because I think that art history, especially of, sort of the, if we want to call it the pre-modern period, which influences a lot of your world building here, it gives you really good insight into like the material culture of the world that they lived into and the sort of objects they were interacting with, and like what sort of prestige is associated with like the various, things in their life. And I think that's such a rich way to build a world. So last year you had your first novel, Dark Woods and Deep Water, and this is a prequel to that, I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, I tried to write a short story. I'm also a short story writer. I've published a number of stories, but I wanted to write a story about Orsiana, because she's a character in Dark Woods, Deep Water, but she's not the main character. But when I wrote her, I thought, there's so much more about her, and I wanted to explore that. And I said, okay, I'm just going to write a 5,000-6,000 word story about her. But she had so much story to tell, and this is one of the situations where characters completely take over and say, you're going to write the whole damn story. There's no way you're just going to cram it into 5,000 words. And therefore I wrote a novella.
That's great. I do love when a story like outgrows its enclosure, let's say. That's really cool. And there is like so much rich world building there. So something that I would love to ask about is that the first book and this one draw a lot on the folklore of the Eastern Adriatic, and a lot of what we might call like myth making stories, if we want to get into that. My question for you is, I guess it's a two-part question. What to you makes Slavic folklore distinct from other world folklores, and how did it influence your world building?
Well, first of all, I mean, there has been a long discussion about what is Slavic folklore anyway, and what publishers think Slavic folklore is, and what people expect from it. And I'm trying to present my own angle here because people are, when you say Slavic, people usually expect Russian or Polish because they're such huge cultures. But I'm Croatian, so I don't know anything about Russia or Poland. Well, very little about them. But what I'm trying to do is present my own culture, which is a sort of a mixture of different influences and different cultures. We are Slavic people, but we're actually Mediterranean people as well. And when you take a look at the place where I live, for example, it has been Venetian territory for almost 500 years. So you see all those influences in my books. You don't necessarily recognize the culture and the history as purely Slavic because it isn't. On the other hand, when it comes to folklore, Croatia has a rich tradition of fairy tales and oral folklore, but we have no written canon. So there are no old written sources we might explore. So basically, all the gods I mentioned in my stories, they are real, but we don't know. I mean, real as gods get. But I don't have any written canon on them. So basically, I had to invent a lot, as writers do, which gives me freedom actually to shape my stories and to use gods the way I see fit, which is I think fortunate because some other cultures and some other writers, for example, Greek writers, don't have that liberty.
That's a very good point because when those stories get written down, they do tend to sort of get ossified, and become like authoritative versions. But oral culture is so much more dynamic and adaptable to like particular circumstances. So I'm really curious about, it's really cool, I think, how the story plays with that. And I also really love how it plays with history too, because I think it rewards knowledge of sort of like medieval and maybe like early Renaissance history. So could you talk a little bit about, what sort of like historical research you did to sort of aid in your world building? And like what the process of fleshing out this world was like for you.
I work with history every day because I work in a museum, so I didn't have to do any particular research for this. But when I thought about the setting, I don't know how well you know Croatian coast or how well your listeners know about it, but I know you've all heard about Dubrovnik and Game of Thrones settings, and so if you imagine a blue sea and sunlit walled towns, you will have the right idea about it. That's what our towns look like. So that would be the setting. And when I thought about history, I mean, medieval history is fascinating, but it's also very bloody. And I try to present that sort of, on the one side, it's like medieval world is incredibly lively and fun and filled with people who like to enjoy themselves and filled with art. And on the other hand, it's full of political intrigue and it's full of murders and things like that. So I wanted to combine the two. And I mean, I didn't one interviewer asked me about the influences for this particular story. And I mentioned it before. I think that the one particular murder that inspired me to write this one was the murder of Giuliano de' Medici in Florence. I'm not going to, I'm not going to tell the whole story here, but I do encourage your listeners to go and look it up because it's really fascinating. But what is even more important is that his brother, his surviving brother, was the famous Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was one of the greatest patrons of the arts in the history of our civilization. So I think that this fact influenced my story maybe more than the murder itself.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's really cool the way that like, yeah, it does balance this really beautiful voice that sometimes it captures like I almost want to call it like a fairy tale-esque sort of voice or like even dreamlike, and then you do get these sort of like stark interruptions of violence and brutality and cruelty sometimes. And that feels very accurate to the medieval world and the contradictions that you were just kind of talking about, the joy and the horror and all of that. But it also gives the characters a lot of really interesting things to respond to. So maybe this is a good time to start to talk about our protagonist a little bit more. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what goes into shaping Orsiana, where you sort of maybe got the inception for her personality. Was it a mood or a behavior or even just a name, perhaps? Where did she kind of start from?
Well, she obviously she started as a character in the other book, Dark Woods,
Yeah.
Deep Water. And I thought, there's always, I'm not saying that women are weak in fantasy literature. That hasn't been true for a very long time. And we have some very interesting and strong protagonists. But I wanted to ask myself, like, what if I had a character who is not a main character, who is a wife and a mother and a companion? And what if she were not just an ornament? What if she were also a person? And what if she were strong? And what if she were capable of influencing everybody around her? So that's where she started. Like, she looks at first insignificant, and because she hides behind her husband, he's so flamboyant and larger than life. But I thought, like, what if she was actually the clever one? Like, what if she was pulling the strings? So that's where she started. But obviously, like, nobody is born a politician. It's something you have to learn. So I thought, what shaped her? Like, what would turn a young girl who was a protected, naive, rich heiress into someone who was capable and cunning and even ruthless if the situation demands it. So that's where she started. And then obviously, the setting and the politics and the history and everything else shaped the rest of her.
Yeah, I really appreciated her character building over the course of the story, because she clearly becomes strong, in ways that are maybe not like what we usually associate with like a strong female protagonist, or like that. She gets to maintain a lot of her femininity while also proving that she can be a lot more than like the sort of small box that she's been put into by society. Yeah, like it's almost, it almost has like the arc of like, to me, a coming of age, but like she's not coming of age. She's just kind of coming to understand the world as it works. Yeah.
She becomes a ruler. That's I think that's the main thing. She learns how power works, and that's something I always wanted to explore. How do you, because what I'm describing of middle towns which were not ruled directly by kings, they ruled themselves. They always had councils. They always had some sort of freedom and some sort of democracy. I mean, Venice was a republic. It was not necessarily a very democratic republic, but it was still a republic, which was a lot different than medieval kingdoms. So I wanted to ask myself, how does it feel to rule people who are expecting to rule themselves, who are not going to obey you just because you inherited the power? And that was something I really wanted to explore there. And also, obviously, the contrast between her understanding of ruling and power and her husband's understanding of ruling and power. And I think that's a very good political lesson they both had to learn at the end of the book.
Yes. Yeah. And in a weird way, it feels very relevant, let's say, to our society, where I think like political opinions and orientations have become a lot more at the forefront of all of our interactions with people, I think. That's very interesting. Yeah. One last question, which is about the pacing and how you achieve that, because it's very propulsive. It's hard to put down. And I kept telling myself, I was like, I'm just going to read until, there's like a lull. And then that just, I just got to the end of the book and I was like, that was great. That's great. So could you talk about how you create that propulsive, can't put down feel and how you pack so much into like a really efficient, because this is a novella, but it's really chock full of like really interesting characterization and things that happen. How do you do all that?
Well, actually, I had some reviewers complaining that it was too short. Like I liked it, but it should have been a novel. They say, I'm an underwriter. I always write less than necessary, and I always try to cut. I like long books. I like books that have, beautiful words in them, but I don't think I'm necessarily that kind of storyteller. And here it was just, I don't know, sometimes the story just demands things of you. And with Orsiana, it just moved so fast. And even even when I considered, like, what if I turned it into a novel? I thought no, because then, I would give her too much space to think and too much space to breathe, and I didn't want that because it happens in a very short a period of time. It happens basically, the whole story happens in a span of a few days. So I wanted it to be fast, and I wanted her to react before she had really time to think what to do. And I'm describing a rebellion, so everything has to happen fast and everything has to surprise you. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so short.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It does. The pace does affect like how urgent her decision making feels for sure. And, I always really like that kind of writing too, because I think it, as a writer, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but it probably makes you think a lot about what you are going to include and what you are going to omit. And to me, that hints at like a much larger world than if everything is on the page all the time. So I really kind of like that storytelling that invites you to think about like what you're not seeing or what you haven't seen yet or what else is going on in the world. So
Absolutely. I mean, the books I love the most and the characters I love the most are the ones where you feel there is a huge story behind them, but the author chose not to tell it, but it's there. But also, one of the reasons I make these things short, and I make these, all my works, all my longer works, standalones, is because I'm an indie writer and it's a practical decision. When you publish with a small press, you don't usually plan to do, a huge trilogy or, a 1,000-page book. You have to be brief and you have to be interesting, and you have to build your books in a way that they work together, but they can be standalones, because otherwise, I mean, this is a purely practical decision in a way, because you just have to do it.
yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me, especially as I think like bigger publishers are really leaning into series and, like I'm sure that there's all sorts of extremely complicated, financial decisions that are driving them to do that. But like, it's probably really hard to get picked up when you have like your first one out there and you have to sell them on books that maybe don't exist yet. So, yeah. Well, this is so lovely. I really enjoyed reading this. Do you think, we just talked about that you write standalones, but do you think you will write anything else about this world?
Oh, I have already. The first draft of my new novel is done. It happens some 25 years after Ghost to Parent. There are some characters which are appearing there again, Oceana among them. So yeah, I'm basically doing a whole cycle, one book at a time. So if this book gets picked up, I think that the readers will be very happy, because I had them asking about certain characters and their destinies, and obviously I try to do what I mentioned before, letting people know that there is a bigger history behind the people and the events, and I hope I will manage to answer some of those questions in the new book.
Oh, great. Well, I'm very excited to hear that, and if you want to come back and talk about that one when it's ready, you're always welcome back to the show.
If you're a great publisher, I certainly will.
Well, then, okay, so then we got to talk to our listeners now and be like, pick up Ghost of Parent, okay? And pick up the first book too. Pick up Dark Woods, Deep Water, and pick up Ghost of Parent, so we can see more of these great stories.
Yes, please do. Please do.
Well, thank you for joining us. This has been really great. And thank you, listeners, for listening in. By the time that you hear this episode, this book will be out in the world. So please go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for books. Thank you so much. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.